Welcome to the current webinar series. This is a special edition of the current webinar series where we are partnering with the Soil Health Nexus and hosting a joint edition of the current webinar series and the Soil Health Nexus Digital Cafe. So whether you're joining us from either group from the North Central Region Water Network or from the Soil Health Nexus team, we're glad you're here with us today. And we're going to be talking about something that affects our soils as well as our communities, as well as our behavior, pretty all-encompassing in terms of impact, and that's drought. Certainly something many of us in the region are currently seeing or thinking about when it comes to next year and next year's growing season. We're going to be talking about drought preparedness and adaptation. We have three different speakers here with us today, and so we're going to be featuring those three speakers and then having Q&A to follow. So the format will be similar to the current webinar series if you have joined one of those before. And this is going to feature a lot of work from our land grant partners, both the North Central Region Water Network and the Soil Health Nexus, our multi-state collaborations between land grant institutions, working across state lines and across institutions to share resources and improve the scope and impact of land grant and extension work. A couple housekeeping items for you before we get started. So we will have a Q&A portion of this presentation, and it will be after all three speakers today. So please put your Q&A, your questions for the speakers in the Q&A panel. There is a Q&A panel and a chat feature. We are trying to use the chat mainly for sharing links. You can use that to introduce yourself to other folks on the webinar today. And to share links and relevant materials. You can also use that if you're having any technical difficulties, and I can try my best on my end to troubleshoot for you. The Q&A panel, which should be at the bottom of your screen, is really what we'll use for questions for our presenters. So please put your questions throughout their presentations there, and we'll go over them after all three. You can also read other questions and upvote those. So I encourage you to do that. We will take those questions that are the most upvoted first. So kind of crowdsourcing the questions to determine those that are most broadly applicable to folks. I mentioned I can try to troubleshoot any technical issues. If you are having those, please let me know in the chat feature. If you are having trouble with audio, there is a phone in option that can be accessed by clicking the up arrow on the mute icon and then clicking switch to phone. I also want to let you know that this session is being recorded. We will place this recording available to you as well as the slides on the northcentralwater.org and on soilhealthnexus.org. Both of those groups have websites, and they also have webinar archives, and we'll be sure to record both and put the posting to both areas. All right, so I mentioned we're going to be talking about drought. Drought is a topic on many of our minds, whether it is right now, which I've known many drought planners that say when you're not in drought is the time to think about drought. So if you're not in drought right now, thank you for thinking about drought when it's not top of mind. And if you are, like speakers in two of our areas, really all three of our areas, but I know there are areas in Ohio. We have Aaron Wilson with us, who's going to be talking about drought preparedness and response in Ohio, where they're experiencing some areas even D4 conditions. We also have Ron Graber from Kansas State Research and Extension going to be talking about some drought resources they have there. They're going on a third year of drought in the Kansas area, and certainly those partners that are in the Northern Great Plains are familiar with drought and face this. It feels like annually, though obviously different years vary. And then we also have May Davenport from the University of Minnesota. So after we hear about two areas currently experiencing more severe drought, we're going to talk to May about some social science research she has done looking at how ag producers that aren't currently experiencing drought, if they may be open to implementing certain drought responses and what impacts those decisions. So we will get started. First off is Aaron Wilson. Aaron is an assistant professor and agriculture, weather, and climate field specialist. He's with the Extension and also the College of Food, Agriculture, and Environmental Sciences at Ohio State University. Aaron's also a longtime partner of the North Central Region Water Network and leads several multi-state climate initiatives, including the North Central Climate Collaborative. And today he's going to be talking about drought response and planning in Ohio. So I will stop sharing and hand it over to you, Aaron.
All right, thank you, Ann. There we go. Yeah, thank you, Ann. I appreciate the opportunity and offer to be on this webinar today to really present, the story of Ohio for 2024 in a larger context. I'm sure there are a lot of lessons that will still come out of this drought. We will be spending a lot of time fully assessing the impacts for this for some time to come. But what I wanted to do is really talk about drought in Ohio a little bit this year, kind of our response at the extension level, and also a little bit at the state climate office level as well. Some hiccups, some challenges, and what we've done to kind of respond to that. So I really appreciate this opportunity. So moving forward, looking at historical drought in Ohio, it's kind of interesting that Ohio, experiences periods of low precipitation last anywhere from 2 to 5 years, generally every 2 to 5 years, with prolonged clusters that occurred earlier in our historical record, 1930, 1966. And this is just using a single index that we use, Palmer Drought Severity Index. It's really good for a long-term drought. It was really heavily relied upon as kind of the sole kind of look at drought in the past. But over the last 40 years, our droughts in Ohio have been relatively, comparatively shorter compared to that earlier period in the 30s and 60s. Where the PDSI isn't quite as low, and sort of also generally during this wetter period as well over the last, say, 40 years, we've been oscillating rapidly back and forth between extreme wet and extreme dry. And that's really something that we've seen across much of the Midwest. Since the U.S. Drought Monitor's inception here, it's really, and thanks to Brian Fuchs at the National Drought Mitigation Center, it's really a hybrid approach where we're taking a lot of different physical indicators, as we know, with local expertise. And that's what I'll dive into that local expertise, which I think Extension played in Ohio and does likely across the entire region, a really big piece to this story. And it's been kind of awesome to see folks from all across the state in our extension really step up and help provide services to our producers across the state. So if you look at the time series for Ohio since 2000, and according to the U.S. Drought Monitor, there's not a lot of red that you see on this time series, red being D3 or extreme drought and D4 exceptional drought. Of course, if you've not really had a primer on the U.S. Drought Monitor, that's a whole webinar in and of itself. I'm not going to do that today, but just looking at the history here in terms of percentiles covered, this year certainly stands out. 2012 was another big year. 2007, we had some D3 around the state. And then before this is really going back to 99 and 1988 as sort of those historical droughts of record for Ohio. So this year, June 11th, we had no categories in drought or abnormally dry across Ohio. By the time we got to the end of June, after some extreme heat, June 25th, we had D1 or moderate drought conditions launched. And what I want to do is kind of take a side here real quick. And for those that aren't aware of the Drought Early Warning System, as part of NIDIS, the National Integrated Drought and Information Systems, we've got these systems in place to think about early warning systems for drought. And ultimately, I think it comes down to a well-connected network of collaborators and partners across the region that really help and bring the magic to drought early warning. And so this was for the Midwest, put out on April 25th, talking about some short-term drought improvements, particularly in parts of Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, but long-term deficits remain. So there was an increased vulnerability to drought. So, the whole Midwest region was already sort of on alert that drought conditions, depending on how the weather played out for late spring and summer, could lead to those drought conditions. So that's certainly something we saw in Ohio, being part of that early warning system. Early on, we noticed that these were rapidly onset drought conditions occurring across large portions of Ohio. So I sent out an email gathering folks as part of our rapid response. So the initiation of our drought rapid response team, which we began the 1st of July. So this was really right before things started to really deteriorate pretty quickly. So as we got to July 16th, D2 or severe drought was introduced in parts of our southeastern counties. By August 13th, we had D3 introduced. This was the first time since August 28th of 2012 that we had any D3 in the state. And it was not in an area of the state that had experienced D3 in the past. And then on August 27th, we had D4 or exceptional drought. This was the first time Ohio had exceptional drought as part of the U.S. Drought Monitor since its inception in 2000. So we maxed out our drought sort of milestones here on September 24th. This was the max that we saw across the state. So over 12% in D4, that's a record most for Ohio. You can see anything D3 or worse, that was the most. D2 or worse, that was the most as well. And as far as coverage goes, it was the 5th most at 94, 94, a little bit more than 94%, only trailing 2002 and 2012 in terms of larger coverage, but the intensity was a little bit different. So those are sort of the milestones that got us started. And so again, what is it? What do I mean by our drought response team? So it was really bringing together our Extension and State Climate Office resources in different areas. So you can see the response team from agronomic system specialists, livestock, beef and cattle, specialty crops, forestry, farm management, especially as we got into some drought declarations and FSA programs, agricultural water systems and soil management. And some of these are going to continue to be kind of key featured research extension topics as we head throughout the upcoming season as well. And then also marketing and getting this information out in partnerships with ODA, our Department of Ag, and many others as well. So we developed online resources, and I'm going to dig into that a little bit, a lot of newsletters through our different channels, and then also with the State Climate Office. So really, we developed this online database to help with, overview of conditions, drought monitor update, connect to our condition monitor observer reports, and a lot of different resources. And you can see the link there. And what I mean by resources is providing as many resources as we can for operationally what to do during the drought, but also some planning and adaptation strategies for different areas of a lot of our producers, again, from agronomic crops to livestock, poultry, vegetables, wine. There was a lot of attention paid to agro-tourism operators, pumpkin farms, corn mazes that really suffered this year as well. But links to other collaborators throughout the state. For instance, the Ohio Department of Agriculture put together this Ohio Hay Directory, where folks could then advertise hay resources for a lot of our producers that were hauling a lot of water, did not have any pasture growth, and really needed some help and continue to need help in the state. So our statewide educator system with Extension really allowed for effective two-way communication with our producers on the needs, and then help to fill those needs and resources. Many of the extension educators had not experienced drought, and certainly not to this level. So we held 2 in-service for our educators and specialists, one focused on agronomic systems, the other one on landscapes and lawns, to help just raise that education for our extension educators that were providing the services out there. We're going to share the slides with you. Obviously, I won't go into too much detail, but I do, want to talk about what it looked like here in Ohio. Certainly looked very different than we've seen over the last decade. But, pastures and livestock were really particularly hard hit. A lot of water hauling, additional 60,000 gallons of water per month for a lot of these producers. And we had poor to very poor range conditions, pasture conditions up to 93% as of September 23rd. We have since recovered a bit. We had some Helene rain and then some cold fronts, but obviously a lot of impacts on row crops. We didn't want to just get the impacts out there, but letting folks know what some of the risks were associated with field fires and harvest as well. Specialty crops, I mentioned the agro-tourism, but a lot of impacts on fruit and nut trees as well, rootstock, berry canes, you name it. Certainly to the level of the hydrology and hydrologic impacts that we've seen, including dry private wells and springs not running. We heard a lot of that since 1988. So there was a lot of coordination at the state level as well to open up some of the state parks for agricultural water use, which is still ongoing today, especially in Southeast Ohio. A lot of landscape impacts, dead grass, trees really changing 3 or 4 weeks early. I was in Minnesota last week, and really we've got color that's similar here in Ohio in a lot of areas to what I saw in Minnesota. So just that drought stress driving some of that early change as well. And of course, staying in tune with the forest and fire impacts. This is a satellite image showing, the same date on 2 different years here, and you can just see the advanced crops, the advanced color changes that were happening. We had a pretty wide range fire ban, open burn ban for most counties that has been lifted since, even though we're still in D3, D4 levels, but the risk has come down in terms of a little bit more moisture and cooler temperatures out there. So this is my last slide. Drought continues and some of the lessons here, and I know this was pretty quick, but we are still in drought and exceptional drought over much of southeastern Ohio at this point. I think one of the things that I like to think about is the partnerships and clear communication is really important for drought response. We have had a drought annex as part of our state operations with the Ohio Emergency Management Agency. That's undergoing some changes this year. Just so happens this is the year that some changes are being made to that. But I'd like to think the strong partnerships that we've built between the State Climate Office and our state agencies over the last several years led to a quick sort of transition to operationally working with both Ohio Department of Agriculture and also the Emergency Management Agency. Again, this is the first time experiencing some of these impacts this year in living memory for many folks. And I think this will help us in our USDM classification moving forward and putting impacts to categories. Agriculture and water supplies in Ohio are robust. And I say this all the time with my stakeholders and collaborators. We're a water-rich region and have a lot of water that folks, maybe out west can't even fathom, even in the middle of drought. But we're not immune to the impacts from drought. So it's important to have drought plans and drought strategies in place. And I think as we continue to prepare these hydrological extremes from extreme flooding, thinking about some of our counties even that picked up 10 inches of rain from the remnants of Hurricane Helene on top of D3, D4 drought, that's not a good situation either. And the combination of drought with heavy rainfall since in some areas has actually led to even further bad conditions for some of our soybean and corn producers out there. So a lot to consider, a lot more lessons I think to come for Ohio, but that's just a glimpse of what we've done here in Extension to help our producers get through this very tough growing season here in 2024. So I will turn it back over to you, Ann. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Aaron. Okay, so I know we're doing it a little bit fast. We have traditionally called the current webinar series, Speed Networking series. So we are going to move right along to our second speaker so we can have time for some discussion and questions later on. So I know Aaron mentioned a little bit about rangeland and rangeland health. So now we're going to go to Ron Graber, who can talk a little bit more about that. Ron is based at Kansas State University Research and Extension, and he serves as a watershed outreach specialist there. He's been there for 14 years. And he's going to be talking a little bit about what they're doing in Kansas, where they're facing in some areas 3 years of drought, and especially how they're helping livestock producers and making sure that they have resources to adapt and plan ahead. So I'm going to stop sharing and hand it over to Ron. Oh, there you go. You're quick. Thanks, Ron.
Okay, there we go. Thanks, Ann. I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about what we've been experiencing in Kansas the last several years, and one of the efforts that our group at K-Care K-State has been involved with to try to help producers and specifically livestock producers in providing clean, fresh water to their cattle. And so, as you can see there, Houston, we have a problem, and we've had a problem now. As you said, this is we've had ongoing drought. This is our third year in a row for for some parts of the state, specifically the part of the state that I'm in. As you can see, this is a practice that we typically recommend as a best management practice. Fence the pond, have a limited access ramp so that the cattle aren't swimming in the pond during the summer. And as you can see, this pond is very much below that ramp. And so yes, we do have a problem. There we go. So just a couple of slides on a little bit of the condition that we are experiencing here. And as you can see, we've got some governor's declarations on drought, and those 3 counties right there in the central, south central part of Kansas is where I'm located, and I spend a fair amount of my time. You can see emergency. So have been declared emergency, and part of the reason for that, and if you think back at the drought map that Aaron showed, and you didn't see a lot of red over Kansas, we have experienced some of that D4 the last 3 years, and it's varied a little bit between D2 and D4. But just to kind of get at that and why we're experiencing some severe situations in terms of trying to provide water to livestock, and this is just a mesonet screenshot of the mesonet station southwest of Hutch, which would be in one of those red counties, not too far from where I live. And if we take a look at this chart, you can see that our accumulated total for the last year is about 2/3 of what normal precipitation is. So we're just about at 20 inches. Typically, we would get around 30 inches in this area. So we're not getting the total rainfall that we should be getting, or we expect to get. The other thing I'd point out is if you look at those daily observations, there's only 3 events in that year's time that hit an inch or more. And as you can see, they're not much more than an inch. If I were to put this same chart up for 2023, it would look very similar. If I go back another year and put the same chart up for 2022, again, it would look very similar. And so we're in a situation where we get these kind of small showers and rains that keep things looking a little bit green, but we're not putting any moisture in our soil profile. So there's nothing there. And we're certainly not creating any runoff to put it to in terms of our streams or our ponds. And so as this just keeps building year after year, we end up with those ponds like the slide I just showed you that are either very low, or in some cases, we've got farm ponds that have been dry nearly 3 years now. And so Aaron mentioned folks hauling water. We very much are in that situation. So one of the things one of the resources that we have available at K-State is a Waters and Watering System Handbook. And this was originally put together about 20 years ago, and we've utilized it as a resource for livestock producers to talk about water systems and different ways of providing water, and maybe some, not just quantity, but quality efforts. Well, it became apparent to us that the volume of calls that we've been getting with our conditions have really ramped up. And so we realized that we need to work on this handbook and update it, add some material, some new chapters. And so we embarked on that a couple of years ago. So if we just take a look at the handbook, and this is the table of contents, and you can see the types of information that are in the handbook. We tried to really cover sources of water. So, absolutely ponds are one source, but there's a lot of other ways of providing water depending on your specific situation to livestock. And so we tried to kind of hit on all of those, talked about pumps and systems and how to provide that water. And then also you can see tanks and just a really wide range. A couple of the things that we've added are blue-green algae, remote monitoring of livestock water, some chapters that weren't in the original edition of this notebook. And so as we went through our group, we kind of divided up some of the areas and really tried to write chapters that were pretty easy to read, would give somebody that was maybe considering some alternative ways of providing water, kind of an overview maybe of a system that maybe some advantages, disadvantages, and just some general kind of information to give them an idea of whether they might want to pursue that. And so spring development was one of them that we included. We also tried to put in a number of kind of technical drawings, and this would be an example of one where, we've really promoted and had a fair amount of producers interested in putting in solar systems, whether it's actually fencing that pond and pumping the water out of a pond into a tank, or maybe even drilling a well that might be a little more dependable in what that pond is in a dry situation or a drought situation like we're in now. And so a schematic that would kind of give them an idea of what it might look like if they decided that they wanted to go with that solar system. We also tried to include quite a bit of information in tables and charts where they could make some comparisons. And here you can see we've got the solar system there at top, and what may be some of those primary advantages and disadvantages, and just kind of a dollar figure to give them an idea of what the relative cost of that kind of a system might be, and so they can compare that maybe with some other system, and if that's something that might play a part into what system they choose. One of the tables that we included that we think has been really useful for producers is, when we try to figure out how much water we need to supply to our cow herd. Well, we can go through some calculations and kind of figure out how much water they might drink a day. And so, we typically think about for a cow-calf pair starting at 10 gallons per cow per day. And then when we get into those summer times, it may be 20 or 25 gallons when we're in July and August and 95 degrees and low humidity. And so how much water do we really need to provide for that cow herd? And so this table gives us an idea. We can look at tanks and how big they are and what the gallonage might be. And this becomes really important when we start talking again about those solar systems that we know maybe aren't quite as dependable as what a well on an electrical system. And so we can look at these tanks and try to figure out, okay, if we need, and we recommend a 3-day supply on a solar system because we know they're not quite as dependable if we have a cloudy day, or if we get into the winter when we don't have as many hours of daylight. And so just trying to figure out how much water maybe we need to supply. So, a really useful table that you can look at quickly and get an idea. Another thing that we added to the handbook this time around was we tried to put in some color pictures just to give people an idea of what things might look like as well. Out in the field or the pasture. This happens to be a system where we have a remote monitoring system there on the post, and we have some folks that have pastures that are as far as 50, 60 miles away, and so especially when we get in that summer period and it's hot and we need to keep track of how much water we can use a remote system, and so that we don't have to physically check those every other day or every day, whatever the situation might be. This is something that in our discussions about revising the handbook, that we thought it'd be really good to have some tutorial videos that folks could go in and look at and actually see how to go about doing something. Tire tanks are fairly popular in Kansas, so we've done a number of tire tank demonstrations over the last few years. And so we put together 8 videos that are kind of 8, 10, 12-minute videos that you can go in and actually watch and see how to go about cutting a tire to make a tire tank, and then the steps of how you would get that level and set it and do all of the plumbing. And so those we think will be very popular. We also thought it would be important to try to get this information out to extension agents, conservation district, NRCS personnel, and so they would have this resource available to use with folks that might wander into their office as well. And so we actually had a couple of field days this spring, summer and invited those folks, tried to get some of them out and kind of did some demonstrations and talked about the notebook and what kinds of things would be in it. And so we had one in Western Kansas and one in Eastern Kansas. We're in the kind of what we would call the distribution phase right now and trying to get that out. We printed about 275 of these notebooks, and so we've got them in every extension office in the state, every conservation district office. We have about 16 watershed or what we call RAPS coordinators in the state, and so we made them available to them as well. And so we really tried to get these notebooks out so that if they have folks or clients that are coming in and maybe looking at different water systems, it's a really handy resource that they can go through and show them. We also have have done a number of presentations and booths, about 6 or 8 presentations at kind of what we would call national meetings or regional meetings. Some booths at like Kansas Livestock Association's annual meeting and convention, those kinds of things where we can just kind of get in front of a lot of folks and and let them know about the handbook that is available. It is available too, free of charge on the website, and so there's the link you can see there. If you go to that, you can download that and actually whether it's a producer or extension personnel or whoever, and be able to look at that on their own computer. We know that a lot of folks like to seek out information in that manner. There's a QR code as well. So if we've made that available, that also will take folks to that same site so that can be downloaded. Just want to acknowledge our team and certainly took a lot of work to go through and revise and rewrite and create some new chapters and the videos. I think that probably took maybe about as long as the writing portion of the project to go out and actually shoot videos and get those edited. Certainly want to give a shout out to SARE. They provided some funds for us to print those notebooks and help get the videos done and get those out so we could use them. And certainly our team, we get some funds through Kansas Department of Health and Environment, and part of that's 319 funds through EPA. So thanks for the opportunity to share a little bit about what we're doing in Kansas and some of the resources that we've been working on specifically for livestock producers.
Thank you so much, Ron. I appreciate that. I've seen that book, and I did include the link in the chat for folks. All right, so moving right along, I'm excited to feature our third speaker, May Davenport. This is especially exciting for me as we think about that concept of thinking about drought before drought. That's the time to plan for drought. May's done some social science research, really looking at what are some of the factors, the barriers that can lead producers, especially in the upper Midwest, where perhaps we aren't used to historically experiencing drought that often, or at that frequency of some of our partners in the Great Plains. However, that's becoming more common, and these extremes. How do we, as extension and as producers, adapt to that, and what makes us open to that? So I'm going to hand it over to May. You can read her title there. She's a professor in the Department of Forest Resources and also the director of the Center for Changing Landscapes at the University of Minnesota.
All right. I am actually at a conference and I'm on my laptop. So can folks see my main presentation?
Looks great.
Okay, awesome. Thanks. Well, I am going to, let's see, just quickly. Oh, did I lose it? I did lose it. Hang on again. Sorry about that. I'm trying to do this on my little laptop. Okay. Bear with me. So as was mentioned, I am a social scientist, and I'm really interested in relationships with the natural environment. And I've done a lot of work with farmers and understanding relationships to not only their farms, but all the resources that are needed in with respect to farming. Let's see. Did I lose the show here?
We are not
Let's
seeing a
see. You're
PowerPoint.
not seeing. Okay. I'm not sure what happened. Let me try that again. Sorry about that. This worked earlier.
It always does, no problem.
All right. Let me try that process again. I think I've got it here. Okay. Share. All right. How's that looking?
Looks great.
Okay. So I'm going to be talking about social science work that we've done with farmers and thinking about drought preparedness and adaptation. Um, uh, One of the things I think to note, and in Minnesota, we don't have quite that track record with drought that maybe Kansas and even Ohio do, but we still are in a drought. Actually, this is the latest drought monitor. You can see where we've got some severe drought, moderate drought as well, and folks are not necessarily prepared, but irrigation has been on the increase in terms of ag irrigation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about behaviors, give you a little bit of social science theory around behaviors and understanding behaviors, and then think through some water scarcity narratives that are really important to understanding how communication happens around drought, and also thinking about where farmers are getting information and how they're applying that information in different ways. Okay. So here we have the standardized precipitation index that shows drier and wetter conditions, as folks know. And in Minnesota, drought is really temporally nuanced. We think about climate change models that tell us, okay, over time, we're going to experience warmer and wetter weather. But we're also seeing an increase in extreme precipitation events and more variability in weather patterns, including longer dry spells and higher potential for droughts. We did have some major droughts that affected crops and agricultural production in 1988 and 2012, and also in 2021. So it's nuanced, and we need to think about sort of those thresholds for adaptation in terms of irrigation. To date, Minnesota has about 707,000 acres in irrigated agriculture. About half of that is corn, and about 81 billion gallons of water are applied annually. And as much as 90% of this water in Minnesota comes from groundwater. So that's really important. And the state agencies are concerned that extraction of water in times of drought can exceed natural replacement by rain and snow melt for that groundwater. And also importantly is that 75% of the state's drinking water comes from groundwater. So you can see here in this chart that groundwater extraction and also ag irrigation is on the rise. In 1990, the legislature and the State Department of Natural Resources create a state drought plan. And then in 2012, in response to droughts and stress on crops, and then also the expansion you can see here of irrigated agriculture, the DNR developed a program of groundwater management areas and designated 2 rural groundwater management areas in Minnesota. And then plans were put in place to better monitor groundwater and ensure sustainable groundwater use. Stakeholders convened, so this included farmers and food processors and irrigation co-ops in an advisory board to provide feedback to this planning process. And let's see here. One farmer that we interviewed in our social science research talked about the public meetings and what the kind of the sentiment was of folks at these meetings. And they said at those public meetings, it would be a full house. Again, so these are public meetings about these groundwater management areas and planning and potential restrictions on withdrawal of groundwater. And they say it's a big deal. You know what I mean? We don't want this resource taken away from us. And there will be a real fight if somebody tries to do it. But at the same token, I think most people understand that if there are really, in fact, issues with groundwater, we're going to do everything we can to manage it sustainably. And then in this map, you can see the two groundwater management areas there in central Minnesota. In the groundwater, there is available from near surface and glacial sands. Okay, and so we kind of based on this shift in irrigation and concerns about the risk of drought, we engaged and conducted a survey, mail survey of 1,500 farmers in these two groundwater management areas, and we had about 460 responses. With a final response rate of 34%, which is actually pretty good if you've ever done survey research, and just sent out, sort of cold surveys in the mail. Achieving 34% is a pretty big deal. So I want to give you a little bit of background on kind of the social science theory behind the work that we did and the survey and the questions we asked. And I guess and the extension agents and folks that presented before me know that it's very complex, like preparing and adapting to drought or to water scarcity, and trying to understand those behaviors and predict them and influence them. It's a complex business, and it's equally complex in social science research. We think about as social scientists, in my lab, we think about different narratives that are out there about water scarcity and how that influences perceptions of risk. And there's a couple of narratives that I guess are big categories of the way in which folks talk about water scarcity. And one is absolute water scarcity, which is basically that physical risk. The question is how much water is there and how many people are using water and how much are they using, right? So pretty basic, like physical sort of assessments of water budgets and things like that. And science, hydrologists and other folks tend to focus on those absolute numbers. As social scientists, we think more, everything has context, and understanding behavior is really important to understanding how people view water scarcity. So we can talk about relative water scarcity, which is the risk experience. Like, have you experienced risk or drought before? What your perceptions are of the current threat, and then your capacity also to prepare and adapt. And that's a more involved formula for measuring water scarcity, relative water scarcity, but it's critically important, and it's important at the individual farm level scale, but also at the community and watershed scale. And so that's what we're trying to get at in some of our research here in Minnesota. One of the big questions we're asking is what influences water scarcity, adaptation, and also perception of risk among farmers. We can think about what are some of the variables that are involved here. And so we've got, irrigation behaviors. We know that folks are going to adopt irrigation in Minnesota if they have a higher risk perception that their crops will be stressed by, drought or water scarcity. We also, though, need to think about sort of what makes up risk perception, and that has to do with the farmer and their individual like experience in the past with risk, their understanding of their own farms and the soils in their farms and how sensitive their farms and their crops are to or their livestock to drought. So that's another, those are two components that are critical to understanding risk perception. But we're not only interested in irrigation behaviors, but also how people talk, how farmers share information and come together to make decisions at a bigger scale. And like that farmer who was involved in the advisory meeting, how did they engage with other farmers and the water professionals or natural resource professionals there. We're also interested in that civic engagement behavior as well. And we think about community capacity to adapt, not just farm by farm, but more holistically at a landscape scale or at a watershed scale. Are there leaders who are sharing information and providing testimonials about water conservation practices or precision irrigation or water sensors on their farms? What is that community capacity and leadership? And then it gets even more complicated when you start to think about who farmers are listening to or who influences farmers' decisions. And there's certainly influences from the agricultural communities, but there are also influences from government, from community leaders at the local level, at the state level. So there's a lot going on when a farmer decides to either adopt irrigation or get engaged in those conversations about protecting groundwater. One of the questions we asked, and I want to give a shout out to my grad student and now postdoc, Dr. Emily Kreider, and her dissertation work focused on how different sources of information affect engagement. And we can think of civic engagement as an adaptation behavior, right? Like learning more and seeking out information and connecting with others and sharing stories. That's a way of adapting to change. So she was looking at ag influences, and ag influences includes commodity groups, lenders, ag co-ops or irrigation co-ops, and then also questions around like county agencies and state agencies, NRCS. Like how do those different groups influence a farmer? And then how does that shape their risk perception? And how does that shape their perception of their community's ability to adapt to drought? And then ultimately in this modeling, statistical modeling that Emily did, we looked at and then overall, how does that affect civic engagement? Interestingly, we found that community capacity, so the confidence in yourself and people around you, your neighbors and other producers, is really influenced by those ag sources of information, whereas government sources of information are most influential in terms of risk perception. So there was some interesting connections there between how folks are influenced and how that affects risk perception and perception of community capacity. And then ultimately, both risk perception and community capacity were really good predictors of civic engagement in groundwater protection. Then another question we asked in this work was focused more on future irrigation behaviors. So we asked farmers about the likelihood that they feel like they'll be exposed to drought, and then also the sensitivity or vulnerability of their own farms to drought impacts. And we learned that those two concepts or variables are really moderated by this risk perception. So that as a risk perception increases, folks are more likely to say they would adopt future irrigation behaviors. And we've got a paper out that kind of frames up that research with several co-authors as well. And we can connect you to that. And just a couple more slides here. One's focusing on sort of this question of like, what are the thresholds for adaptation? When will farmers in Minnesota adopt irrigation? And we can see, different thresholds. And this, again, is this, it depends kind of response. But when we get down to thinking about 25% of farmers adopting irrigation, that's where we start to see that tipping point, I think, for Minnesota. And then ultimately concerns about groundwater protection. But you see here, we get to 25 when farmers think their operation has experienced one bad drought year, maybe every 5 years, they would be likely to adopt, or moderately or extremely likely to adopt, or if scientific models predict that a serious drought will occur every 10 years or every 5 years. There's some thresholds there to think about in communications. And then just like ultimately, there's a lot that's going on in Minnesota related to water. And I'm at the statewide water resources conference right now, and folks are talking about nitrate pollution. They're talking about pesticide contamination of groundwater, fluoride from road salts. In some counties, like Otter Tail County, which is near one of those groundwater management areas, more frequent dry periods or droughts throughout the summer is their top concern for farmers that we surveyed. And so, it is on people's radars. And then you can see, for others, it was their number 11th concern in Wabasha or number 12th concern in Olmsted counties. So there's variability out there. But definitely folks in central Minnesota are concerned. They're thinking about irrigation. They're also installing tile drainage, so it's irrigation and tile. There's a lot of factors, a lot of variability. But I think those narratives really matter. And so for my work and how we share this work, we talk about like, what is your narrative of risk? How do you define risk? And how do you communicate about risk to the folks that you're working with? And then I would just encourage folks to think about civic engagement, and the extension presentations really pointed to the need to just engage people in those dialogues and having good conversations and honest conversations about drought and its impacts and what farmers can expect in the future. And that's it.
Thank you so much, May. I really appreciate it. I think that's an interesting look forward. If we look at some of those like big picture, what will our landscapes look like when we look at the future of the upper Midwest and some of the decisions folks are thinking about. But you're also right in thinking that it's a highly localized from county to county or issue. I'm going to jump right into questions because we have a few here from folks, and I want to make sure we can answer as many as possible. So I'm actually going to go to this question from Stefan for all speakers first. Are you aware of farmers who have drought emergency plans in place prior to drought? So that kind of gets back to my point there that I've heard many folks say the time to think about drought is when you're not in drought, but that's always hard for humans to do, for us to plan like that. Did they have a plan in action? Was that pre-planning helpful? Did farmers with a drought plan fare better than other farmers that didn't have that planning? So I'm going to just open it up to all three of you if you have any comments or thoughts on that general question.
I might just jump in there, and since I was visiting about livestock, and drought is not new to us in Kansas. We experience some level of drought, on a regular basis. Certainly some counties, some areas more often than others. So, I think our livestock producers are being forced to be prepared. In a situation like we're in now, when maybe they have relied on ponds and now we're, hauling water all summer and that sort of thing, they're being forced to find other sources, whether that's drilling a well or, what the case might be. So, I think they're getting better prepared all the time.
They just might not call it that.
Yeah.
Sometimes, right? Erin, or May, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, from my perspective, that's actually a question that I plan to ask during the upcoming winter meeting season is, what did you have in place? My hunch is, based on conversations that I've had, that because we've been lulled into this sense of we're usually dealing with too much rainfall, that there hasn't been a lot of drought planning, or because we've had short, intense periods of drought, they've not quite had that long-term impact that we saw this year that was very different than even droughts of like 2016 or 2012. So that's a question that I plan to ask. Some folks, I saw a lot of knowledge transfer between kind of the older generation that remembers 1988 to some of the newer generation that were taking over farms. That, it's like, no, son, thinking of a couple of particular, stories that I heard at our farm science review, like, no, the springs have run your entire life. They were not running in 1988, which is what we saw this year where they stopped running. So, thinking about alternative water sources and that sort of thing, some of that was going on, but this is a question that, as Stefan asked about, probably don't have a lot of data. I don't have a lot of data on that, just anecdotal stuff and something I plan to ask.
Yeah, and I would just add in Minnesota, I mean, we're kind of the new kids on the block in terms of irrigated agriculture and responding to drought. We're in a drought right now, and Minnesota Extension, I know, is working very closely with farmers through cost share programs and technical assistance programs. They received a multi-million-dollar grant from NRCS to focus on precision irrigation and water conservation strategies. And there's just more effort to bring farmers together and irrigators together to talk through, like, what are the consequences of the corn row crop systems that we have, and their need for water, their need for nitrogen, and how is that affecting the natural ecosystems and in a water-rich state like Minnesota.
Yeah, thanks. I think this is a common human problem, this kind of planning for things far off. I think I'll speak personally, my retirement plan speaks from this, that humans struggle with this. So I think it's a common issue and certainly something we'll be thinking about more. A question for Aaron. Folks are curious, did the 2024 drought affect municipalities of all sizes, including drinking water and other sources? How are you currently facing that or supporting more of the community side of it? I know you deal with the ag.
No, absolutely. And I focused a lot on ag, but a lot more folks that we work with throughout the state. Largely, this was a lower, and I want to phrase this really carefully. I mean, it's a lower populated area of the state. Obviously, still a pretty large number of people. We had over 3.5 million people in drought during the peak. Some things that kind of stood out. And there were some additional water strategies and additional, like, reserve water supplies built in after the 1988 drought. So for instance, this year, Columbus opened up sort of an alternative reservoir to allow additional water to flow down. So that was something that had not been done in the past. So there wasn't any voluntary or mandatory water restrictions for any of our large cities. We did have some smaller communities that were we're within probably about 70 days of running out of water. But again, 70 days seems like a long time, but obviously this is something they had not experienced in a while. I think the burden was really felt by individuals, small farms and livestock producers that don't rely on, a lot of those municipal water systems that with dry wells and dry springs, really were hauling every single day gallons of water to keep the operations moving. And so, our experience is always grounded in the reality of where we live and what we do. And I think, again, even though we didn't see large scale impacts on our major municipal areas, the water burden was quite immense for a lot of the smaller areas and smaller producers as well.
And if I could, I might comment on that in terms of our area as well. And city of Wichita is the largest city in the state of Kansas, 400,000. They also supply water to several of the surrounding communities. So if you take into account all their individual customers, it's about 500,000 people, as well as some industry. And so Cheney Lake, which supplies about 2/3 of Wichita's needs, is being severely impacted by the ongoing drought that we've got. It currently is at 57% of conservation pool. It's down about 8.5 feet. So it's basically about half full. And I talked about the, not getting anything that generates runoff, and that has really, really impacted Cheney. And so Wichita has been in what they call stage 2 of their drought plan now for about 2 months, which is restricted outdoor watering. So depending on which part of town you live in, you can water 1 day a week and has to be at night and that sort of thing. And so, if we continue in this pattern, and it looks like we may, then they would go to stage 3, and they're predicting that may happen next spring or summer, and then there would be no outdoor watering as well as some other restrictions. And so, I talked about livestock, but certainly the municipalities in our area are being impacted pretty significantly.
Yeah, absolutely. Something I sometimes think about over in some of our more western states, but certainly happening here. I wish we had time for more questions, but I do see that it is 3 o'clock on the hour, and I want to be cognizant of everyone's time. So I'm going to quickly share my screen here and put up the emails for all of our presenters. So please, if you have a question you weren't able to get answered, please go ahead and email them directly. I understand we weren't able to answer all the questions today, so I've listed them up there. This webinar is recorded, and we will put it up on the website, both for the North Central Water Network and for the Soil Health Nexus, so you can view those there. Special thanks to our speakers here for joining me today. I really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone, and I hope to see you at next month as we have another edition of The Current and another edition of the Soil Health Nexus Digital Cafe. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Rob.
My